Hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited for this. We've been working on this a while. You're here. This is the 2017 Global State of Digital Learning Results. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dylan Rogers. I am the editor-in-chief of the Schoology Exchange blog, and I'm here with two of my favorite people and educational masterminds, Kelly Adey, the Director of Instructional Strategy, and Adam Larson, the Director of Educational Solutions. Kelly, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Dylan. As Dylan mentioned, I'm Kelly Adey. I'm the Director of Instructional Strategy for Schoology, and I joined Schoology just about a year ago after pseudo-retiring from 25 years in education, all in the state of Colorado. I started my career as a high school English teacher at Denver Public Schools, and then made a transition into instructional technology, first as a building level technology coordinator, and then I moved into the district level for Cherry Creek School District.
Excellent, thank you. And Adam, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Adam Larson, Director of Educational Solutions. I've actually been with Schoology for close to 3 years now, where I've been working with clients really around the world to help them see Schoology as a solution to the issues that they face, and of course understanding the issues that they do face and bringing those back to Schoology to make sure that our product continues to be that solution. I came from an educational background. I was a teacher for 5 years, both at the intermediate and elementary level, and that's where I really found my joy and passion for teaching. After that, I moved on to be a campus instructional technology specialist and also a district level one, where I worked with teachers all the way from calculus to cosmetology to integrate technology into the classroom. And I'm really excited to be able to be on this webinar specifically to talk through some of the data that we were able to get from around the world.
And as mentioned, so we all work for Schoology. Just a little bit about us. Schoology is the provider of the most widely adopted K-12 learning management system in the U.S., with more than 1,500 customers and 20 million users worldwide. Now, the survey respondents, about 25% of them are Schoology community members. So 75% not being Schoology community members make sure that this data is filled with tons of diversity and insight. So let's take a look at what this survey is all about. So this was a general study that we started in May to June, and then have been crunching the data and working on this since. 2,846 K-12 teachers and administrators from 89 countries participated. The reason we did this is because, like you, we have an obsession with education and ed tech in general. We wanted to provide concrete insights about education that you can use to, let's say, validate your own strategies or even try new ones. So how did we do this? We assembled a crack team of former educators and content specialists. Both Kelly and Adam were on this team to help design the survey. We conducted it online and provided it via email, our blog, social channels, and word of mouth. We try to get out there as much as possible. One thing to note is that some of these questions were conditional based on the roles of the respondents or the answers they provided in previous questions. So, for example, if you said you didn't have an LMS, then you didn't get LMS related questions. So let's take a look at who actually participated in this. And many of you who participated in this are on this webinar right now, which is great. Thank you for coming again. So the breakdown by role here, you can see that most of the respondents are teachers in grades 6 through 12, and their experience ranges all around the board, but the majority of people have 11 or more years of experience, many of them even over 20 years of experience. Adam, you had mentioned that this was interesting to you. What'd you say earlier?
Yeah, really because of two things. One is I'm always interested in hearing what end users in the classroom are really experiencing. So to see such a large percentage of teachers, whether they're from 9 through 12, 6 through 8, or even younger than that, I'm just really glad that a lot of the data that we are going to see has some of those background. Also, I guess I was a little humbled by this. I'm kind of in that green section of that donut chart. I believe that's the technical term for it, correct? Donut chart.
Yeah,
on the right-hand side, I'm in the green section. I don't even know if we have a... Kelly, where are you at on this one?
I would be solidly in the blue, Adam.
Only in the blue, which is amazing, being that you're 28 right now. So that's fantastic.
I started early.
Well, if it makes you guys feel any better, I am below the orange level. So, well, moving on. So we had institutions of all sizes, all different enrollments, as you can see on this chart on the left, and most of them are public schools and districts. Now, here's a breakdown on the regions of the U.S. All regions are represented, mostly in the South and the Midwest. And I am a Southwesterner, and I wonder if any of you Southwesterners out there are looking at this and wondering, where is that? Well, this is the census breakdown, just so you know. But this is a global study, so we have insights from around the world, and 89 countries. Here are the top countries at the top. United States, most people are from there, but runs the gamut all around the world, which is great. Thank you again. So let's talk a little bit about what we're here to do today. You will be receiving an ebook that covers all the findings. It's almost 50 pages, so we didn't really feel like it was a good use of your time to walk you through that and then give that to you later. Instead, we thought we'd highlight some of the most interesting findings of the survey, discuss what they represent, and add some personal context and external research. So we'll start with insights from inside the classroom, that's with teachers. Then we'll move on to insights from outside the classroom, which is anyone who's a doesn't spend most of their time in the classroom. And then insights about the learning experience in general and kind of where that's going. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to get to them. But keep in mind, so we have quite a few people attending the webinar right now, and that means we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. Okay, it's enough about all that. Let's dive in. Adam, take it away.
Well, thanks, Dylan. And also just to kind of set expectations of how this webinar is going to run, Kelly and I are going to be kind of going into our background experience and looking at some of the data that we see throughout this the survey that we took and the data that resulted from that. Just know, though, this is not comprehensive. We're going to be making some points that matter to us, and hopefully through the chat in the question area, you can add even some of your own comments, and then Dylan will be bringing those to the table for us to talk about as well. So with that said, let's go into the very first question that we're going to talk about. So each of the slides, too, I want to explain how the slides are going to work. You're going to have a question at the top, which is the kind of question that we put to the respondents, or at least a paraphrase close to it, and then you're going to see some of the results. So some of the results are going to be self-explanatory, like for instance, on this one, the question was, what are the obstacles that are most present when trying to integrate technology in the classroom? And what we found is that out of all the respondents, 43% of them chose lack of time. Now, they could have chosen multiple ones, so this wasn't just like a choose one only, but out of all the different ones, lack of time was chosen as the #1 way to incorporate technology. And one of the interesting things I thought about this one is how, when it comes to technology in general and integrating technology, which is what I did for several years, is one of the big things I would always tell teachers is that when you integrate technology, this is a way for you to save time ultimately. Now, it's not something that you're necessarily going to experience right away as there's learning curves with everything, as you're trying to figure out the right way to kind of put this technology into your classroom, but ultimately this is a thing that's going to be able to save you time. And I always think it's interesting when we're dealing with obstacles to really understand what a teacher in the classroom might say as being a challenge for them to actually integrate technology and be able to have some kind of response for that. So for those of you, especially out there that are the PD specialists or your tech coordinators, just know, based upon the results that we saw, lack of time is going to be their #1 issue, and that's something that you need to be ready to handle.
I think also, Adam, like when I looked at this list, when I saw the not enough devices aspect of access, I think that, there's a lot of focus we hear about one-to-one, but the reality is a lot of organizations are not in that position. And so I think another thing to think about is how can we be more effective about, using technology for stations or in a rotation kind of environment so that we can leverage the technology that we do have and view that, like you said, as a challenge, but not necessarily an obstacle that we have to overcome. The other thing I thought was interesting was lack of access at home. I noticed that, in my previous district, we started off being very concerned about that, but we saw this explosion of mobile devices. And, I think it's worth noting that access at home may be less and less of an issue as smartphones and things that are really, providing that connection from home on a handheld device, those are becoming much, much more pervasive.
Yeah. And it's interesting with a question like this, you can also kind of think of it on the flip side of things. If, for instance, if 25% said that they had difficulty creating lesson plans and integration strategies in general, that means 75% did not select that. So possibly there's also some good things that we're seeing from this kind of data, that there are certain obstacles that aren't felt by our teachers. But it was interesting to note specifically about that one. A lot of the other selections that teachers could have made, or users in general could have made, is things that were possibly outside of their control. But when it came to something that was maybe really on them, right, like creating that lesson plan to integrate technology, only 25% said that that was an issue. And we'll be seeing that kind of more as we go through the rest of the presentation, figuring out how that time and lack of knowledge to do things is a bigger obstacle for other things.
I think, one other thing that when I saw this list, I don't think I found myself surprised. There are things I thought were interesting, but it wasn't anything that I saw where I was shocked. And I think part of that's because those of us that have been working in this space for a while know that these are not necessarily new challenges in educational technology for integration. And it's even echoed, I think, in other studies that have been done and other, kind of surveys that have gone out. I know there are organizations all over that do that kind of survey, kind of like what we did. And one of those is Project Tomorrow. I want to give a shout out to our colleague, Kara Gann, who pointed us to this resource as well. When we, looked at their 2016 survey that they'd done, they posed a very similar question, but it was focused in terms of who they were targeting at school principals. And one thing that I thought was interesting was, those top three that we had in our survey are also echoed here. Lack of teacher training, or, PD, access to devices, and then balancing instructional time constraints. So obviously these issues aren't new. And I think it's kind of up to us to figure out how do we then help overcome these challenges, and how do we come up with, strategies that help us leverage what we do have when we have it.
Yeah, I think a common theme of what you even said, Kelly, is that, when things aren't necessarily new, right? And that's good but we do need to find solutions for those things that we know to be problems. If we actually go to the next question, this is another thing that we don't necessarily would be unexpected to us. The question was, what type of instructional resources are used most in your district or your division or your institution? And again, they could select all that apply. And the number one response was PDFs, Word docs, and other static text-based resources. And this, again, is not unexpected. I mean, if we even talk about how integrating technology works, it always starts with where teachers are at currently, right? And how can we leverage where they're at to get them to eventually where they want to go? And I think this is a great example of how PDFs, especially when it comes to instructional technologists like I was back in the classroom and back supporting teachers, that those are things that we have to recognize, and we need to make sure that we keep pushing teachers forward. We actually had an article that came out that I wrote in conjunction with Dylan, talking about how we need to go beyond the PDF. That oftentimes in instructional technology, PDF is a three-letter word, but it's a basis of a lot of things that teachers are doing.
I think, when I looked at these particular results, one thing that I thought, this actually caught me off guard a little bit. I think I thought that OER would be higher. Yeah. In terms of instructional resources, because there's a lot of attention paid to OER, and there's really some great content out there. I think that's a dynamic space right now where there's a lot of things being added, and I think people are taking a closer look at that. I'll be interested to see how that number changes over time.
And back to that static resource comment, Kelly, you and I had talked about how the PDFs and Word docs, yes, those are static resources, but we also kind of lumped videos into that as well because it's a one-way form of communication. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think, when we think about where we start out, I think Adam and I were talking about this earlier offline. There's often like an area of comfort that you start off. You think about like, what do I have now and what can I use? And I think that, when we look at what happened previously in the slide before about lack of time, maybe some of the static resources being used here are due to, not having time to actually develop other content.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then in this conversation, of course, comes up the SAMR model.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of folks that are in tech integration have seen or heard before, that idea that when you first start to use technology, there's kind of a natural progression of that use, and that, as you get more and more comfortable, you begin to reach those higher levels. I think one thing that I was curious about in terms of the PDF and Word documents, there could be some things that are happening dynamically with those resources. Maybe they're not as static, as you'd think, but when you look at kind of where you start off, sometimes you start off with what's comfortable and available, particularly if you've got budget constraints. So I think that, maybe this is a reflection in some cases of, where people are just naturally entering into integrating technology in a meaningful way.
It's interesting, specifically talking about the SAMR and the aspect that PDFs are the most common things that are being used. Donna asked a question about our previous slide about, how do you overcome that obstacle of lack of time? And this is exactly kind of the point I think the SAMR model makes, right? That if you are trying to have teachers integrate technology, it's very difficult for them to have to tackle two things at once, right? So for instance, if they're having to build some kind of online simulation or find these kind of resources, that can be a difficult step for them, and it's going to require a lot of time. However, if that teacher maybe is a lecture-based classroom, right? Perish the thought, but let's say they are, they can obviously easily start integrating technology in the classroom and create a blended learning environment by putting that PowerPoint that they present in class into maybe their LMS. And here's the interesting thing about that specifically is that as you have the teacher starting to do that process, they start understanding along with their students that, if I'm being able to provide a presentation online, then my students don't have to write it down in class. So there's a need for some other things to be brought in. And especially when it comes to lack of time, it's trying to leverage things like Kelly mentioned, that OER kind of content, and being able to leverage that in these classrooms so that they're not having to build everything themselves. It's leveraging things that are already created.
Yeah, and I think something else, and we'll see this echoed, I think, throughout the results that we explore today, but I think another way that you overcome that time barrier, and something that actually ties in with SAMR, is can you collaborate with others and, do some work together so that you're not the only one owning that integration. I don't want to call it a burden, but, that impetus, if you're working with other people collaboratively, sometimes that helps not just with time, but also with coming up with ideas. Maybe you don't have an idea of how to make something a little bit higher on the scale, but your colleague might. And so I think that collaboration could help in multiple ways here.
Yeah. And I think to answer Lisa's comment, she was wondering where like the Google suite of tools would be listed in that question that was asked. G Suite is a kind of thing where you have a lot of static type documents that can be created, whether those are Google Docs or slides or spreadsheets or sheets. However, we all know, especially if you've been working with trying to create less static documents and more interactive things, even though that kind of content can be changed. So a lot of times it's all about perspective. Sometimes, like for instance, I've created Google Slides that are almost simulators, right? Where they click here and it takes them there. So there's all different ways on how people view G Suites, but in my mind, it kind of starts off as static, but it could be obviously far reaching than that too.
And I think also when we're talking about instructional resources, I think that's more about like curriculum content that's being integrated. And you can create curriculum content in in G Suite, obviously, but really when you think about stuff that you're using in terms of your scope and sequence, I think that Google Suites is often something that's a collaborative. That's an online activity. It's an engaging collaborative resource you can use for learning. And it does have some resources, but I think this question may have been more about like what's out there to use for curriculum. And I don't know, Dylan, maybe you can shine some light on that in terms of what that question was really getting at.
Sure. No, this is really just was a question on what resources were being used most. So I think that pretty much runs the gamut. We weren't specifying it to any particular piece.
Okay.
Cool.
So go ahead, moving on. We've talked about the obstacles. We've talked about the resources that are being used. Now let's look at kind of how they're being used and in the different pedagogical practices.
So one of the things that, again, that this particular question, how it was set up, is that there were multiple options that were selected, and they could select, whichever ones applied to them. And in very same way as we saw the PDFs, being the most oftentimes used instructional resource, in the same way, when it comes to pedagogies, we see differentiated learning being at the top. And that possibly is because that has been around the longest, right? I mean, if teachers have tried to do anything besides that lecture style classroom, differentiation is that first step. So I think with this one particularly, you see differentiated learning being at the top, but right behind that is that blended learning. And blended learning is the kind of thing where obviously it takes that face-to-face instructional time and the online portion and harmonizes it together to create a better and more meaningful learning experience. And that's why you see, with blended learning, you also see things like individualized learning or flipped learning or personalized learning. Everyone's going to take their own take on how they're leveraging blended learning, even differentiated as part of that process, but it's neat to see how all those kind of fit together.
I was interested too in looking at, we talked about one-to-one earlier in terms of, what schools that might be one-to-one or have that device access. And I think that's also where, blended or hybrid could come in, because if you don't have one-to-one, you can do some very creative things with blended learning, with either, rotation or with, having students that might have bring your own device or whatever. The other thing I thought was interesting was the purely online learning being kind of lower on, that scale. I think that with purely online learning, I think there's still some hesitancy sometimes in, whether or not that's really the best approach, and, how do you make those connections, with students? It's, that relationship part becomes, I think, a different kind of a challenge in a purely online environment, where blended seems like you get the benefit of, having that face-to-face contact with students, and then also letting them do some things on their own as it makes sense. So online's interesting.
Yeah, the other interesting thing with this too is that how, and this is us as a survey, and we were kind of toying around with the idea, but should one-to-one learning even necessarily be here, right? One-to-one that's more of like the technology saturation level, right? So it's always interesting as we are growing as a company and we're wanting to make these kind of surveys more insightful, whether that's, adding things like the G Suite specifically, or, Microsoft's kind of OneDrive things, or maybe refining the way that we're asking questions. I think this is something that we're going to continue being able to get more data. But Dylan, I know that we talked about, we really wanted to see what our users thought about this particular thing. Can you do that one?
Yeah, that's right. So we have put together a poll to see, what do you think respondents ranked as the #1 most effective strategy? All right, so the poll is launched. You should be seeing that.
Hey, Dylan, I did not know that I would not be able to take this poll. I really wanted to take this. You don't want to throw.
You already know the answer, though.
Yeah, but I'm thinking what I think is #1, right?
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this, and let's share the results here. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Excellent. So it looks like it's pretty close between individualized and differentiated instruction, and blended learning would be third in line. What do y'all think about that?
Yeah, I'm interested in having people see what the actual the survey showed from our data.
Sure.
Yeah,
well, here we go. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say before we get there, we actually had a question from Lisa that said, please clarify the difference between individualized learning and personalized learning. And that's a great question because there is so much. I don't want to say confusion, but I'm not sure that we have a standard definition for all those across the board. But Adam, personalized learning is something you and I have been talking about a lot. And how that is different from either differentiation or individualization.
Yeah.
So for me, I would say, personalized learning has to do with the student being part of that construct of what they're learning. So they share in seeing their own data and making their goals. And then, we hear things like, learning paths or, control over pace and place and time. I think that with individualized learning, it has aspects of that. But the way I think about that is something that is almost, I want to say, like done by algorithm, so that, a student does something and they get something that's provided to them to do next. I don't know that they always have the same level of choice and voice. Those are the things that we hear most of personalized learning and individualized settings that they do in personalized. What would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, I mean, it's almost like, it was funny, I was talking with a school district just the other day in that the comment was personalization is not a button. There's nothing that you can do with technology to create true personalized learning. It's so much a conversation between a teacher and a student. It's a journey, it's a path that students are going on that a lot of times they're setting the pace. Whereas individualization is, I think of always an example that I go to is that kind of like that math classroom, right? Where you're having a math classroom and you're teaching content, but every student is taking it at their own pace, right? There's one student might be done with first semester in the first 2 weeks, and the other student might be, lagging behind the others. It's all about students kind of going through a journey that a teacher already creates for them. But personalization is more of the students creating their own journey.
Okay, well, let's check those results against what we found with our survey data. So this is, again, the list of the pedagogies that are being practiced. Everyone could answer multiple questions. Now, I believe it was individualized. It was individualized learning and differentiated were neck and neck. Well, survey says blended learning. Most of our respondents thought blended learning was the most effective pedagogy. Then differentiated learning, and then personalized learning, in that order.
And one of the things I think I like about this one specifically is that, again, how blended learning becomes a core functionality of a lot of those other things, right? For instance, if I'm trying to differentiate, having technology come and support that is huge. And same way with personalized learning. I think personalized learning is a great example. If we go back to that SAMR model, like that is the upper echelon of using technology to achieve something instructionally that couldn't happen otherwise. And I think that's one of the great examples of it.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and move into our insights from outside the classroom. Kelly, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so we saw that graph earlier from Project Tomorrow about PD being the #1 challenge, and when we talked about the respondents of this who identified themselves in a role outside of the teaching roles that we had as a selection, I thought it was interesting here that yes, we see PD as a challenge, but we talked earlier about how do you overcome the lack of time, and if we see here the lack of collaboration being a challenge, I thought that was really interesting. And part of that's because, we work with a lot of districts, and the district I came from was very heavily into PLCs. And so my thinking was, well, we have, PLCs because they're so prevalent, collaboration is just happening. I think that in my head, thought it would be not the challenge. I did not think it would be #3. I also wanted to bring out #5 because we were talking about effective pedagogy earlier, and the assessing and reporting on teaching strategy and effectiveness. That's something I think that all of us are concerned about, and especially when you think about the work that John Hattie has done and Robert Marzano on what do we do that has the most impact on student learning. That's still going to be something that we continue to try to figure out. As educators and as those who really are passionate about what happens in the classroom.
And with me, that it's amazing what a difference adjectives make, right? So for instance, the very first one that was the top challenge is providing relevant and effective professional development. If this question would have just stated providing professional development, I'm not thinking that this one would have been as high. But the minute you start using the terms like relevant and effective, that's where you start having the issues. And I think, even as we go through the rest of the data in this presentation, and as you individually have a chance to look at the survey results yourself, I think you're going to see that professional development keep coming up again and again. The key is around the relevance of that PED and also the effectiveness.
Well, that's a good point, Adam. So we want to throw it at the audience again. So in your opinion, what PD strategy is most effective out of this list? I'll have that pull up for you in just a second. So we have single session workshops, regular coaching, periodic workshops, online blended courses, and on-demand or asynchronous PD. Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close this for time's sake here and share your results. Wow. Regular coaching, 48% agree that is the most effective. Kelly, you had mentioned that based on other research that this is meant to be the most effective. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was actually reading an article about implementation from Learning Forward, and there was a research study done, and this is back in 2002 from Joyce and Showers. But they had this chart about the actual impact of different like PD strategies and whether or not that actually translated to classroom practice. And they had study of theory, a demonstration, doing some practice on their own, and the actual transfer to actual practice was like 0 for study of theory and demonstration, and it was only 5% of the participants had an increase for practice, but with peer coaching, it was 95%. And like, that's just such a crazy high number for effective PD strategies. So I thought that kind of fleshed out this very well.
Yeah, well, now that we know what the audience thinks is the most effective, let's take a look. Oh, go ahead, Adam.
I would also add that Schoology webinars are probably the most effective PD strategy, just so everyone knows.
I think actually, Don made a great comment in chat about what works for kids usually works for adults too. That's such a great point. Sometimes I don't know why we don't often think of adult learning sometimes mirroring what we think is most effective for students.
Well, let's take a look at what types of PD are actually out there. So this is a question on, we asked what types of PD are being practiced in your institution. So you could answer have multiple answers here.
So, and this is, again, what's really interesting here is that, the top 2 of the top 3 answers, the periodic workshops and the single session workshops, like for instance, in the poll that we just took with our audience here, 5% of them thought that single session workshops was the most effective. And it's really interesting to think about if our institutions are practicing certain types of PD, but the vast majority of individuals don't feel that's effective, that's where we have an issue. Now, it's interesting when it comes to single session workshops, they are probably going to be the most common simply because there are things that institutions have to do, right? We have to do a training on this. We have to do development on that. And, the state is requiring us, things like that. So I definitely understand that process, but we can't allow those mandated kind of trainings dictate our other things. And specifically, if I scroll down this list here, I look, only 18% of those who were polled said that the online or blended courses are part of their PD that's being practiced. So, I mean, even in those single session workshops, you could still utilize a blended kind of learning environment to provide that information. I know in Schoology, we do that all the time as we're helping institutions start implementing Schoology throughout their institution. That's one of the big things, is taking the things that they're already doing, like bloodborne pathogen testing, which every school has to do at the beginning of the year, and putting that as part of a blended learning kind of experience. And again, the other thing too is that the 2 key words, again, is effective and relevant. Those are the biggest challenges that our admins are facing. And do we see this list as being both those things?
And look where regular ongoing coaching is. Knowing the the stuff that I just read about, like how powerful that is. I hope, and I know that, you know, there's some things that make that difficult to pull off in terms of time and staffing, but I'd love to see that number go up.
Well, even in the situation where you have the video reflections or observations, this is something that we, you know, Kelly and I, we talked about this a long time ago, is, you know, I wish that that kind of thing would happen more in classrooms, where a teacher could be able to submit a video of them teaching and submit that as proof of their content. Like, what a great thing for teachers to be able to have really ownership of presenting themselves as teaching great lessons, even if it's for the camera. I know that there's some debate around that. I'm not going to get into that today, but like, great lessons being taught by teachers is always a good thing.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to get back to Don's point about modeling, you know, there's some research out there about, you know, we should be modeling the behavior that we want to see when we're doing PD. So if we are doing PD on blended learning, it should probably be in a blended environment. So this particular piece of research came out of the Journal of Online Learning Research, and I thought this is a great quotation to pull in about how we should be modeling those professional practices and techniques for efficacy to impact and transform instruction in the classroom with fidelity. And that gets to that idea of, if we are doing something that is PD related, are we seeing that translate into practice when they're actually working with students?
That actually works really well with our next data point too. So the question is that we asked is the LMS used in the classroom also being used in PD? So again, this is one of those conditional questions. If there is an LMS being used in the institution, is that same LMS that teachers are using in the classroom being used for professional development? And almost 1 out of 2 teachers say yes. So that means we are modeling in our professional development a method of teaching that is outside of the scope of the LMS, which is a huge missed opportunity to actually provide a modeled coaching kind of training.
Yeah, I know that in my previous district, we used the LMS that we use for students also with our adults. And, you know, one thing that I think I heard over and over again was people's kind of aha moments when they were a student, basically, and seeing how that worked in a professional learning construct, and then thinking to themselves, oh, I should try this with students. And I think that that's a much harder thing to translate to practice when you have different systems that are being used.
Yeah, totally agree.
So another thing that, you know, we think about in terms of PD is, you know, are PLNs and PLCs really effective? So, you know, we have a huge percentage of people here that, you know, really felt like PLNs and PLCs were effective for PD. It's probably worth mentioning, you know, we clarified earlier what, you know, personalized learning was versus individualized. You know, the PLC construct, you know, from Rick DeFore is based around those 3 essential questions of what do we want students to know, how do we know if they've learned it, and what do we do if they don't, or what do we do if they have? So, you know, that's a very focused, you know, I think it's a very focused structure for working together and collaborating. PLNs, I think, are a much looser kind of, it's really something that you do on your own. You create a network, and, you know, I think that one of the most effective places to do that PLN would be, you know, on Twitter. Actually, that was my first kind of entry into the PLN world. And the just-in-time learning you can get from a PLN is fantastic, and we see that in our own, you know, Schoology educators group. How somebody can just post a question and they get immediate responses from that PLN that's built in. So, you know, one of the things though that I thought was interesting as well, and it's on the slide, is that getting faculty to collaborate was one of the #1 priorities for those that were not in the classroom. And there's just such value in being able to collaborate with others.
Well, especially when what I love here is where you have the administration's #1 priority is getting that faculty to collaborate, and 81% agree that that is effective ways to develop professionally. Like, I think that's always a win. So wherever you're at and listening to this webinar today, hopefully you're thinking about how you can actually take that collaboration, and in whatever way that you do it, and really have your professional development starting with that in mind.
Well, that leads us to our next point, which is at what level are our respondents collaborating? Now they could only choose one level here, so it's the level that the highest level of collaboration.
Yeah, I think I think we're naturally going to see collaboration happening on a higher level with department or grade level teams. And I think about the office, like when you have an office mate who can help you with something and you collaborate together. But I think what surprised me here is that even though that's the highest one, it still was only 30%. So we're seeing collaboration happening elsewhere. I thought that one was going to be higher, but I do like looking at the across multiple departments, and then even how powerful is it that you can actually connect globally? That is obviously a much smaller representation. Again, I think it'll be interesting to see how that number shifts over time as tools become more widely available to help people collaborate across distances.
Yeah, well, especially I think, again, we get back into modeling behavior here, right? Like how oftentimes in a school building is collaboration requiring someone to actually be in the same room together?
Right.
And if we say, oh, well, if we're not all together in the same room, then this can't really be a good meeting, right? Or we can't really talk through this idea. So I think I agree with you, Kelly. I think my hope is that in the future, as more and more technology is available for us to collaborate over long distances, whether that's G Suite of tools or whether that's online platforms to provide content sharing in the same location. I really would love to see this kind of move forward.
Yeah, and I think that this is another area that we've seen research support that. For those of you that are familiar with Project Red, they've done a ton of work around what they've seen, and this is specifically around one-to-one environments. But this particular report just came out in May 2017, and I thought again this was such a germane thing to bring into the conversation that really the research is clear that collaboration, not isolation, is the best practice for professional growth for teachers. And I feel like of all the things that we've seen today and that we've talked about, collaboration seems to be coming up more and more. And I feel like if we could really get better at that, it might help some other areas that have surfaced as challenges or obstacles.
Yeah. I want to go back real quick. Stephanie made a comment specifically around kind of the obstacles that are in place with blended learning as professional development. And I think it even goes back to how that we saw that slide where 1 in 2 teachers don't even have their professional development delivered through the same learning management system that they use in their classroom. And I think the disconnect, Stephanie, from my point of view, is again some of the autonomy that exists within the district, right, or the siloed behaviors of districts, where you have one department making a purchase and making a plan without the other in the loop. And I know that Kelly's role specifically, working with client services and helping out our clients, is all about bringing all those people to the same table. So to my suggestion to you, Stephanie, is really having a time that those kind of things are shared, the ways that you are modeling behavior for teachers are actually rather expecting teachers to blend learning in their classroom, that those same expectations are being given to those other departments so that they're aware of them too. So
yeah, I want to bring up a comment that Jody made as well, because she mentioned, with the presence of social media, that percentage should be way higher. Why are we not connecting globally and we have those vehicles? I think, one thing I'd like to see next time, if and when we do this again, is asking people if they do have a presence on social media. I think that would be interesting to see as well, and if there's a correlation there.
So for the sake of time here, we are running out. Let's go ahead and move ahead. Beyond collaboration too, does your district or institution have a dedicated instructional technology staff?
And one of the things that I see here is that we have 60% having that institutional instructional tech staff that's there to support. One of the interesting things, as Kelly even mentioned, like, in the future, what happens with this survey, I would love to see how many of those are campus-based that are there for that just-in-time kind of learning and support, and how many of them are maybe more at the district level. The percentage that I really love here is that 26.74%. I love how precise we are, Dylan, by the way. The 26.74% say that no, we don't have anyone dedicated, but we have some faculty stand-in. Like, who better is it going to be to deliver professional development than the teacher next door? Obviously, that is a huge burden, so it's not something that I'm always wanting to suggest. However, I'm always thankful for, specifically if you are one of those people that is the stand-in faculty member, thank you so much for what you do, and we really appreciate you helping move technology forward in general.
We did some cross-analysis here to look at whether or not you had dedicated staff, no, but faculty stood in or not at all, and how that related at all to LMS satisfaction. So the people who have the most dedicated technology staff also answered the highest amount of satisfaction for their LMS.
Yeah, we actually, and this was when I was actually even working with some of the clients and early on at Schoology. I remember working with a client who purchased Schoology district-wide, but they only had 2 dedicated instructional tech people for a district of 36,000. And it's that kind of a thing where you have much more satisfaction with your technology in general when you have the staff that's supporting them. Now, obviously, we don't have the time to go into all the details of how to make that kind of thing happen, but it's important. Kelly, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I just want to point out that's another thing. If you look at the ISTE essential conditions, one of them is that dedicated technology support. That is an essential that has to be there for something to be successful.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on to the insights about learning. Kind of looking forward, we're going to start by looking at priorities. And Kelly.
So, this again, we had different roles are identified for the respondents, and we already talked about those other priorities that we saw: collaboration, we saw new devices, digital citizenship. These were all things that admins had mentioned. Teacher priorities, though, implementing a new instructional approach. I actually got really excited about seeing this because, and this actually echoes something that I think Dennis put in the question area about, do you think that some of this information means that we are stuck in a rut? I think seeing this graph here about how we have people that as a priority, they want to implement something new, I think that's fantastic because, that means that people have some aspirations about what they can do, additionally, and if they're collaborating and if we can help solve some of the issues around time and working smarter. I thought that was great. The other thing that I thought was interesting was look at number 3. We have collaborating again as a top priority, with the learning community, with the PLC. If you prioritize that, I think it actually impacts the other areas here. If you need to digitize curricular resources, but you're working with a team, you can actually, divide and conquer. You can actually, move some things digitally to assessments maybe, where you each can take some questions and collaborate together in a test bank. So again, my big takeaway from today is, collaboration.
Yeah, and something too. Again, if after this webinar, we'll be making this the global state of digital learning available to all of you, and we really encourage you to look through that, because one of the things that is not on this slide is a priority that was kind of towards the bottom, and that was aligning content to standards. So, for instance, you have creating of digital curricular resources, creating these digital assessments, utilizing new instructional approaches, but everything along those lines also requires tying things to standards. And one thing we just want to be careful of is that we don't go so far to build a house without having the right foundation. And aligning content to standards might not make a whole lot of sense for some of you and where you're at, but as you start moving towards more, let's say, personalized learning, having content that's tied to standards is a huge part of that process and something that you need to just keep in mind.
Yeah, and so we wanted to go ahead and do our last poll of the day, which is moving on to digital learning and its impact. Here we go. The poll is launched. So what impact does digital learning have on student outcomes, in your opinion?
Again, no telling, Dylan.
I'm not gonna tell. Sorry. Didn't mean to spill the beans so early. I thought I was doing like a, ESPN play-by-play.
Or election night coverage.
So we're up to about almost 50% of people have voted. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. Share your results. Wow. Very positive. Takes the cake.
We have 2% of people, though, who are on this webinar saying that it has no impact. Maybe it just has impacts on them.
Well, I think what's interesting too, and something worth thinking about, is the people obviously that are watching us today and are interacting with us are people that are interested in digital learning. And I think obviously when we do a survey and we ask people about digital learning and it goes out digitally, we're going to have a response rate that obviously, especially for those of us, we're passionate about this. We believe it does make a big difference.
Sure. Well, let's see what our respondents said. So in terms of does it positively impact student growth or achievement, most people said very much, and people are in somewhat. You do have a few outliers on the end there. What do you think about that, Kelly?
I think I would want to, that's one thing I've always said about data is that when you look at data, it always leads to more questions.
Sure.
And I think that one of the things that I would be curious about is in what ways are we measuring that achievement? So when we ask that question, is that asking about test scores? Because if you look at something, like an assessment that's given and it's a snapshot, is that how we're measuring the student growth or achievement? I think that's obviously a much, much larger question. I think that, the other thing that we would need to ask is, to what degree is it not positively impacted because of that lack of PD or that lack of time? Is that very little or not at all because of those other challenges that we identified earlier, or lack of access, for example?
Well, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, or even back to our, one of the other ones where, is digital learning those static resources? 87% of those respondents saying, yeah, I have static resources as part of the digital learning, but is that what's really going to allow student growth or achievement to happen? And if you're stuck in that way, and this goes back to Dennis's comment, if we're still stuck in that kind of consumer mentality that we just want to give things that they can just, have, but not really making the impacts, that's a problem.
Sure, and we looked at whether it positively impacts faculty as well. Now, this was more on the somewhat side, as you can see. So it is, according to our respondents, better for students than it is for the faculty.
So these people need to be on more Schoology webinars. That's what I'm thinking, so that they can have a higher, very much standard.
Well, think about when we saw the results earlier from what types of PD practices were being offered. How much of that was digital? We had a lot of a lot of workshops, a lot of things that may be happening outside. There's that disconnect. So it could be that it's not impacting faculty growth as much because we need to see it happening more and modeling that in a more effective way.
Well, we have a question from Donna here of what are ways admins can assess and report on student performance? You were talking about this earlier, Kelly, about maybe we're not doing, there's a question on how we're doing that. Well, what are some different ways that admin can do that?
Well, I think it goes back to Adam's point about making sure that we're actually tying some of the things that we're doing to standards. Because if we're really trying to measure student growth, and we're trying to measure that apart from those one snapshot assessments that happen annually or whatever, we need to be doing that on an ongoing basis. And we all talk about being data driven. And, we have a ton of data, and what's the phrase? Data rich, but information poor. I think we need to really be thinking about what we're measuring and how we want to see that, because that means if admins need to assess and report on student performance, but we're not tying those things to standards where we're tracking it, that's extremely difficult.
Another comment too that Don actually made, and this goes back to right here where it says, does digital learning positively impact student growth or achievement? he ties sort of those digital resources with student motivation. And student motivation is not necessarily listed right here, but obviously has big impacts on how well students achieve. So again, this is ways where, as we're thinking about asking questions and getting results, ways that we want to incorporate the right language to ask the right questions.
Yeah, and one of the correlations that we found in this that we just thought was interesting is that the respondents who use their LMS more also report higher levels of student engagement.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that, I mean, any teacher knows that you're going to have students who are going to be engaged in your class, and you're going to have those who are not going to be engaged. And what we've seen with the results here is that when an LMS is used every day, we have very high levels of engagement happening in that class. Now, we would like to think, with a tool like Schoology, that number is directly correlatable, but we understand that there's a lot of different factors here, but it's still interesting to look at. And also, on the same way, on the flip side, those who are very unengaged have the largest percentage of not using a learning management system. And since learning management systems are kind of viewed very broadly in this day and age, it's interesting to see that high number there.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this. We need to skip over this question here. Sorry, Justin. But I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the survey, everyone who joined us today. I hope that you find this ebook and this data as valuable as we have. And thanks to everyone who helped put it all together.
Dylan, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thank you for doing this. Have a great day.